September 1, 1939, Berlin, Reich Broadcasting House. As German tanks rolled across the Polish border at dawn, Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels sat before a microphone in the heavily guarded broadcasting center, preparing to deliver the lie that would justify invasion to millions of German listeners. His voice, when it came through radio speakers across Germany, was measured and righteous. Last night, Polish forces crossed our border and attacked German territory. German soldiers are now returning fire. We did not want this war. Poland has forced our hand through repeated provocations and aggression. Germany acts only in self-defense. The statement was a complete fabrication. There had been no Polish attack. German SS troops wearing Polish uniforms had staged a fake assault on a German radio station near the border. A false flag operation designed to provide the pretext Hitler needed. But millions of Germans listening to their radios that morning believed they were hearing truth from their government. They believed Germany was the victim, Poland the aggressor, and the coming war a justified response to enemy provocation. Radio had delivered the lie directly into their homes, spoken in authoritative tones that discouraged doubt or questioning. The Second World War was the first major conflict where radio played a central role in shaping public perception, maintaining morale, and conducting psychological warfare across borders. Radio reached into homes across entire nations simultaneously, creating shared experience and collective understanding, or misunderstanding, of events. It bypassed traditional gatekeepers like newspapers and allowed governments to speak directly to citizens in intimate, personal ways. It could cross borders and reach enemy populations with messages their own governments couldn't suppress. Nazi Germany had pioneered the use of radio as a tool of totalitarian control, understanding earlier than most governments that radio was the most powerful propaganda medium ever created. Goebbels built an elaborate system of radio control, censorship, and propaganda that kept Germans isolated from truth and fed a steady diet of lies, distortions, and carefully constructed alternate reality. But radio proved to be a double-edged weapon. While Germany used radio to control its own population and attempt to demoralize enemies, the BBC and other Allied broadcasters developed counter-strategies that eventually penetrated German information control and reached millions of people living under Nazi rule with messages that contradicted official narratives. The battle between radio lies and radio truth became a crucial front in the war. Less visible than military campaigns, but potentially just as important for determining which side could maintain the will to fight when the costs became unbearable. Building the Nazi radio state. Joseph Goebbels understood radio's propaganda potential better than almost anyone in the 1930s. When he became Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in March 1933, one of his first priorities was establishing absolute government control over German radio broadcasting. Before the Nazi takeover, German radio had been a relatively pluralistic system with regional stations, some private ownership, and content that reflected diverse political viewpoints. Goebbels systematically destroyed that diversity within months. All private and regional stations were brought under centralized control of the Reich Broadcasting Corporation, Reichsrundfunkgesellschaft. Station directors were replaced with reliable Nazi party members. Journalists and broadcasters who weren't sufficiently enthusiastic about the new regime were dismissed. Programming was standardized across all stations to ensure consistent messaging. But controlling broadcasting infrastructure wasn't enough. Goebbels needed Germans to actually own radios and listen to them. Radio ownership in Germany in 1933 was relatively low compared to Britain or the United States, with fewer than 25% of households owning receivers. Most radios were expensive, costing 200 to 400 Reichsmarks, equivalent to several months' wages for an average worker. Goebbels solved this problem through the Volksempfänger, people's receiver. The VE-301, introduced in August 1933 and named for January 30th, 1933, the date Hitler became Chancellor, was a cheap, mass-produced radio specifically designed for propaganda purposes. It cost just 35 Reichsmarks, roughly 1 week's wages for an average worker, affordable for most German families. The government subsidized production and offered installment payment plans to maximize ownership. The Volksempfänger was deliberately designed with technical limitations that served propaganda purposes. It could receive German broadcasts clearly and powerfully. The domestic stations came through with excellent quality, but it struggled to receive distant foreign broadcasts. The receiver's limited sensitivity and selectivity made it difficult to pick up BBC or other foreign stations that might contradict German propaganda. The limited range wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate design feature to keep Germans listening to German broadcasts while making foreign broadcasts difficult to access. The propaganda campaign promoting the Volksempfänger was remarkably successful. By 1939, over 70% of German households owned radios, one of the highest ownership rates in the world, approximately 16 million receivers in a nation of 80 million people. Germany had become the most thoroughly radiofied society on Earth, giving Goebbels unprecedented ability to reach massive audiences simultaneously with coordinated messaging. Radio programming under Goebbels was a sophisticated mixture of entertainment and propaganda. About 70% of programming was entertainment, music, drama, comedy, quiz shows, designed to attract and hold audiences. The entertainment kept people listening and created positive associations with radio as a source of pleasure and relaxation. But even entertainment programming carried ideological content. Music programs featured German composers and celebrated Germanic cultural superiority. Historical dramas emphasized German greatness throughout history and justified Nazi policies as continuation of German destiny. Comedy shows mocked Germany's enemies and reinforced stereotypes about inferior foreign peoples. News and political programming made up about 30% of content, but was scheduled at prime times when audiences were largest. The main evening news broadcast was mandatory listening in many workplaces, schools, and public spaces, where loudspeakers were installed specifically to ensure people heard official announcements. Goebbels personally supervised news content, often writing or editing major stories himself. News broadcasts presented carefully constructed versions of events that served Nazi purposes. German military operations were always successful with minimal casualties. Enemy forces were always suffering catastrophic losses. German production was always exceeding targets, and life in Germany was always improving. The broadcasts mixed truth, half-truth, and complete fabrication in ways that made it difficult for listeners to distinguish what was real from what was invented. Some details were accurate, dates, places, names, which lent credibility to the overall narrative. But the interpretation, context, and significance were distorted to serve propaganda purposes. Perhaps most importantly, German radio never acknowledged German defeats, setbacks, or problems. Military reverses were described as tactical withdrawals or strategic repositioning. The disaster at Stalingrad in winter 1942 to 1943, where an entire German army was surrounded and destroyed, was initially presented as a heroic last stand and only gradually acknowledged as a catastrophic loss. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 was initially dismissed as a minor landing that would be easily repulsed. The consistent optimism and denial of obvious problems eventually destroyed German radio's credibility with its own population. But that process took years, and in the meantime, millions of Germans believed what their radios told them because they had no access to alternative information sources. The crime: listening to foreign broadcasts. The Nazi regime understood that their information control was vulnerable to foreign radio broadcasts that could reach German audiences with alternative narratives. The BBC German service, launched in 1938, broadcast news and commentary in German that directly contradicted Nazi propaganda. Swiss, Swedish, and even Soviet broadcasts could be received in parts of Germany. In August 1939, just before the war began, the Nazi government made listening to foreign radio broadcasts a criminal offense. The Decree on Extraordinary Radio Measures prohibited Germans from intentionally listening to foreign stations or spreading information heard on foreign broadcasts. Violations were punishable by imprisonment and, in extreme cases, by death. The decree was publicly announced through all German radio stations, newspapers, and public notices. The message was clear: listening to enemy radio was treason, aiding the enemy, and would be severely punished. Local block wardens, Nazi party members assigned to monitor neighborhoods, were instructed to report anyone suspected of listening to foreign broadcasts. The Gestapo arrested thousands of Germans for radio crimes during the war. Most received prison sentences ranging from months to years. But some high-profile cases resulted in death sentences designed to terrorize the population into compliance. In 1940, a Catholic priest named Joseph Müller was executed for listening to BBC broadcasts and sharing what he heard with parishioners. The execution was widely publicized as a warning. The prohibition created a climate of fear and suspicion around radio listening. Germans who wanted to hear foreign broadcasts had to take elaborate precautions. Listening late at night with volume very low, using headphones, closing all windows and doors. Trusting absolutely no one with the knowledge that they were listening. The risk was substantial. Neighbors might report you, family members might inadvertently mention it to someone who would report you, or Gestapo agents might detect the radio signal itself. Despite the risks, hundreds of thousands of Germans, perhaps millions, secretly listened to foreign broadcasts during the war, especially BBC German service programs. The BBC provided news about actual military situation, reported on Nazi atrocities, and offered perspective dramatically different from German official narrative. The listenership created an underground information network. People who heard BBC broadcasts would carefully, quietly share selected information with trusted friends and family members. The information spread through whisper networks, creating an alternative understanding of the war's progress that contradicted official propaganda. By 1943-1944, as German military situation deteriorated, more Germans were willing to risk listening to foreign broadcasts, because German radio's constant optimism was obviously disconnected from observable reality. When German radio claimed victories while German cities were being bombed nightly and German armies were retreating on all fronts, people sought alternative information sources despite the danger. The prohibition on foreign listening was itself an admission that Nazi information control was vulnerable. If German propaganda was truthful and compelling, people wouldn't need to be threatened with prison or death to keep them from listening to foreign broadcasts. The severe penalties revealed that the regime knew its narrative couldn't compete in a free marketplace of ideas. Lord Haw, Germany calling. While Germany tried to prevent its citizens from hearing foreign broadcasts, it simultaneously conducted extensive radio propaganda aimed at enemy populations, particularly Britain. The most famous German propaganda broadcaster to Britain was William Joyce, known derisively as Lord Haw. Joyce was British-born, raised in Ireland, and had been active in fascist politics in Britain during the 1930s as a member of Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. When war appeared imminent in August 1939, Joyce fled to Germany to avoid arrest for his fascist activities. He was quickly recruited by German radio to broadcast propaganda to Britain. Joyce's broadcasts began with his signature phrase, "Germany calling, Germany calling," spoken in an exaggerated, affected upper-class British accent that made him instantly recognizable and eventually mockable. The nickname Lord Haw Haw was coined by Daily Express journalist Jonah Barrington, referring to Joyce's pretentious, aristocratic-sounding pronunciation. Joyce broadcast nightly from Hamburg, and his programs were easily receivable in Britain. The broadcasts mixed news commentary, criticism of British government and leadership, predictions of German victory and British defeat, and specific details about British conditions designed to suggest that German intelligence knew everything happening in Britain. A typical Joyce broadcast from October 1940 during the London Blitz went something like this: Germany calling, Germany calling. While British government officials assure you that all is well, the truth is far different. Last night, German aircraft struck military targets across southern England with precision and effectiveness. British fighters, despite propaganda claims, were unable to prevent our attacks. Casualties among British civilians continue to mount because your government has failed to provide adequate shelter and protection. In London, the working-class districts of East Ham and West Ham have suffered extensive damage that your newspapers don't report. Factories in Birmingham and Coventry have been destroyed. British ship losses in the Atlantic continue to climb. 3 more merchant ships were sunk this week. Though your Admiralty conceals the truth, how long will you allow Churchill's government to continue this futile war? Germany has no quarrel with the British people, only with the warmongers and plutocrats who profit from your suffering. The sensible course is to make peace while Britain still exists as a nation. The broadcasts were sophisticated propaganda that mixed truth, half-truth, and fabrication. Some details were accurate. Joyce did report real bombing damage, sometimes naming specific streets that had been hit. This created impression that German intelligence had comprehensive knowledge of British conditions. But the interpretation was distorted. British casualties were exaggerated, German losses were minimized or ignored. The bombing was portrayed as punishment for British government policy rather than German aggression. The British government was blamed for suffering caused by German attacks. Joyce's propaganda strategy had several clear objectives: create fear by suggesting German bombing would continue and intensify, undermine confidence in British government and leadership by claiming they were lying about the war's progress, suggest that resistance was futile because German victory was inevitable, create class resentment by claiming that working-class people were suffering while elites remained safe, and encourage defeatism by suggesting that peace negotiations were a sensible alternative to continued fighting. Initially, British authorities were concerned about Joyce's potential impact on morale. His broadcasts were easily receivable, he sounded authoritative, and some of his details about British conditions were accurate enough to seem credible. The government considered jamming his broadcasts or making listening to them illegal. But monitoring revealed that Joyce's effectiveness was limited by several factors his German handlers didn't fully understand. His obvious propaganda purpose made British audiences skeptical. Everyone knew he was broadcasting from Germany as German agent, so automatic skepticism greeted his claims. His exaggerations were easily detected when he claimed catastrophic damage in cities or towns that listeners knew had suffered only minor hits. His predictions repeatedly failed to materialize. He predicted imminent German invasion that never came, British surrender that never happened, and collapse of morale that never occurred. Most importantly, his affected upper-class accent, which his German employers thought would make him sound authoritative, increasingly sounded ridiculous to British listeners, especially working-class audiences. His pronunciation and manner of speaking marked him as a pretentious phony rather than credible source. British audiences increasingly listened to Joyce for entertainment rather than information. His bombastic style, obvious lies and failed predictions became subject of mockery. Comedians imitated his Germany calling introduction, music hall performers parodied his accent, and ordinary people made jokes about his claims. By 1941, British government recognized that Joyce was actually counterproductive to German propaganda goals. He had become a figure of ridicule rather than a source of fear or doubt. His broadcasts continued throughout the war, but his influence declined steadily as British audiences treated him as joke rather than threat. After the war, Joyce was arrested, tried for treason, and hanged in January 1946, one of the last people executed for treason in British history. His execution was controversial because he had been born in America, not Britain, and his British nationality was questionable. But the verdict reflected British anger at his propaganda work and his choice to serve the enemy. The BBC, Truth as Weapon. The British Broadcasting Corporation's approach to radio warfare was fundamentally different from German methods, and that difference eventually proved strategically decisive. The BBC maintained editorial independence from direct government control even during wartime, and crucially, it reported bad news as well as good news. This honesty was initially controversial within British government. Officials wanted to suppress information about defeats, bombing damage, and casualties, believing that bad news would harm morale. The Ministry of Information pressured the BBC to present only positive news and suppress anything that might discourage the public. But BBC leadership, particularly Director General Frederick Ogilvie and his successor William Hay, insisted that credibility required honesty. They argued that people could see bombed buildings themselves, knew neighbors who had been killed, and experienced disruption to daily life. Denying obvious reality would destroy BBC's credibility and make people suspicious of all official information. The BBC adopted a policy of reporting military setbacks, bombing casualties, and shipping losses honestly, while maintaining confident tone about ultimate victory. The approach was risky. It required trusting that British people could handle difficult truths without losing faith. The strategy succeeded brilliantly. BBC News broadcasts during 1940-1941 reported British reverses honestly. The Norway campaign failure in April 1940, the evacuation from Dunkirk portrayed as military defeat despite successful rescue of troops, bombing casualties during the Blitz reported with reasonable accuracy, shipping losses in the Atlantic acknowledged rather than concealed. This honesty created credibility that German radio completely lacked. When BBC reported victories, the Battle of Britain in autumn 1940, successes against Italian forces in North Africa, the sinking of the Bismarck in May 1941, audiences believed the reports because BBC had proven willing to report bad news. The credibility advantage was enormous and cumulative. BBC could claim successes and be believed, while German radio claimed successes and was increasingly suspected of lying. BBC built trust through honesty that no amount of German propaganda sophistication could overcome. The BBC also broadcast to German-speaking audiences, launching the German service in 1938 that became a crucial source of alternative information for Germans living under Nazi control. The German service broadcasts provided news about actual military situation, reported on Nazi atrocities, challenged German propaganda claims, and offered dramatically different interpretation of events. BBC German service programming mixed straight news with sophisticated commentary and analysis. Broadcasters included German refugees, anti-Nazi Germans who had fled the regime, and native English speakers who were fluent in German. The programs were carefully written to be credible to skeptical German audiences who had been conditioned to distrust foreign propaganda. The approach emphasized factual reporting rather than emotional appeals. BBC German service reported German military victories honestly when they occurred, which established credibility. When it then reported German defeats or problems, audiences were more likely to believe those reports because BBC had proven balanced. The broadcasts also provided information that Germans couldn't access through official channels. Accurate reporting on German military casualties, information about concentration camps and Nazi atrocities, news about resistance movements in occupied countries, actual situation of the war in Russia rather than German propaganda version, and honest assessment of Germany's deteriorating strategic position. Listening to BBC German service was extremely dangerous for Germans. Imprisonment or death if caught. But hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of Germans secretly listened despite the risks, especially as the war turned against Germany and official propaganda became obviously disconnected from observable reality. The BBC also broadcast to occupied Europe in French, Dutch, Norwegian, Danish, Polish, Czech, and numerous other languages. These broadcasts provided occupied populations with news their German occupiers tried to suppress, maintained morale by reminding them that resistance continued, coordinated resistance activities through coded messages, and promised liberation was coming. The broadcasts to occupied countries included coded messages to resistance movements, seemingly nonsensical phrases that had prearranged meanings. The famous phrase, Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne, the long sobs of autumn violins, a line from French poetry, was the prearranged signal that D-Day invasion was imminent. Broadcast on June 5, 1944, to alert French resistance to prepare for action. Radio Berlin. The lies multiply. As the war progressed and Germany's military position deteriorated, German radio propaganda became increasingly disconnected from observable reality, accelerating the collapse of its credibility even among Germans who had previously believed official narratives. The coverage of the Battle of Britain in autumn 1940 exemplified German radio's approach. German broadcasts claimed that the Luftwaffe was systematically destroying the RAF, that British fighter strength was collapsing, that London and other cities were being reduced to rubble, and that British surrender was imminent. The claims contained elements of truth. The Luftwaffe did inflict significant damage, and RAF losses were substantial. But the overall narrative was false. RAF fighter strength was maintained through replacement aircraft and pilots. British air defences remained effective, and German losses were unsustainable. When Hitler postponed and then cancelled the planned invasion of Britain in October 1940, German radio simply stopped mentioning invasion and claimed the Luftwaffe had achieved its objectives. The narrative shifted without acknowledging that the entire Battle of Britain had been preparation for invasion that never came, an implicit admission of failure that radio propaganda tried to obscure. The invasion of Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, generated even more elaborate radio lies. German broadcasts claimed that Soviet forces were collapsing, that millions of Soviet soldiers had been captured, that Moscow would fall within weeks, and that Stalin's regime was on the verge of collapse. Some of these claims were temporarily true. German forces did advance rapidly, did capture enormous numbers of Soviet soldiers, and did come close to Moscow. But German radio consistently exaggerated successes and minimized problems. The fanatical Soviet resistance that slowed German advance, the harsh Russian winter that German forces weren't equipped for, the enormous distances and supply problems that German logistics couldn't solve, and the Soviet ability to move factories and rebuild armies that German intelligence had completely underestimated. When German advance stalled outside Moscow in December 1941, and Soviet counteroffensive pushed German forces back in chaotic retreat, German radio described it as elastic defense and withdrawal to prepared winter positions. The broadcasts never acknowledged that this was the first major German defeat of the war, or that it demonstrated that blitzkrieg tactics couldn't achieve quick victory in Russia. The disaster at Stalingrad in winter 1942-1943 created the greatest propaganda challenge German radio faced to that point. The entire German Sixth Army, over 200,000 soldiers, was surrounded in Stalingrad, gradually destroyed through months of siege, and finally forced to surrender in February 1943. It was catastrophic, indisputable defeat that couldn't be hidden or explained away. German radio's coverage evolved as the disaster unfolded. Initially, the siege was portrayed as heroic stand. German soldiers holding strategic city against overwhelming odds. Special broadcasts featured messages from soldiers in Stalingrad, emphasizing their determination and sacrifice. Music programs played patriotic songs and classical works suggesting noble heroism. As the situation became hopeless, the narrative shifted to emphasize heroic death rather than victory. The soldiers in Stalingrad were portrayed as martyrs, making ultimate sacrifice for Germany, buying time for other operations through their suffering and death. When surrender finally came, German radio delayed announcing it for days. When the announcement came, it framed surrender as the conclusion of a heroic epic. The Sixth Army had fought to the last bullet, had inflicted enormous Soviet casualties, and had died rather than accept defeat. The broadcast declared 3 days of national mourning and played solemn music. The Stalingrad coverage was sophisticated propaganda that made the best of catastrophic situation. But it couldn't obscure the basic reality. Germany had suffered enormous defeat, an entire army had been lost, and the myth of German invincibility was shattered. More importantly, many Germans knew soldiers who had been at Stalingrad and never returned. Casualty lists in local newspapers contradicted radio claims about heroic sacrifice. These were deaths in catastrophic defeat, not glorious victory. The gap between propaganda and observable reality began destroying German radio's credibility with its own population. Goebbels's total war, propaganda desperation. Joseph Goebbels's famous Total War speech at Berlin Sportpalast on February 18, 1943, just weeks after Stalingrad defeat, represented a fundamental shift in German radio propaganda strategy. The speech was broadcast live across Germany and occupied territories, reaching millions of listeners. Goebbels opened by acknowledging, for the first time in such a direct, public way, that Germany faced a crisis. The tragic Battle of Stalingrad is a symbol of heroic, manly resistance to the revolt of the steppes. It has not only a military, but also an intellectual and spiritual significance for the German people. Here, for the first time, our eyes have been opened to the true nature of the war. We want no more false hopes and illusions. We want bravely to look the facts in the face, however hard and dreadful they may be. The admission that Germans had been fed false hopes and illusions was remarkable. Goebbels was essentially acknowledging that previous propaganda had been dishonest. But he framed this as facing hard truths rather than admitting systematic lying. Goebbels then asked the audience a series of 10 rhetorical questions designed to generate enthusiastic responses and create impression of national unity. Do you want total war? If necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything that we can even imagine today? Do you want our leadership to ruthlessly deploy all means to achieve victory? Do you trust the Führer absolutely? The carefully selected audience, loyal Nazi Party members, roared approval to each question. The broadcast was edited and mixed to make the approval sound even more overwhelming and unanimous. The radio audience heard what seemed like enthusiastic national consensus supporting total war and absolute faith in Hitler. But the speech revealed desperation beneath the triumphant rhetoric. Goebbels was asking Germans to accept even greater sacrifice, longer war, more casualties, because the quick victory propaganda had promised for years wasn't coming. The speech implicitly acknowledged that everything German radio had said about easy victory had been wrong. The total war speech marked a shift in German propaganda from confident predictions of victory to grim determination and calls for sacrifice. Radio broadcasts increasingly emphasized themes of holding out against overwhelming odds, fighting to the death rather than accepting defeat, and trusting Hitler to find a way to victory even when situations seemed hopeless. As Allied bombing of German cities intensified through 1943-1944, German radio struggled to maintain morale while German cities were systematically destroyed. Broadcasts acknowledged bombing damage. It was impossible to hide, but blamed British terror bombing and suggested German civilians were martyrs like Stalingrad soldiers. But the propaganda was undermined by reality Germans could see and experience. German radio claimed German air defenses were inflicting unsustainable losses on Allied bombers. Yet the bombing continued and intensified, suggesting the claims were false. Radio claimed German industry was unaffected and production was increasing. But Germans could see destroyed factories and experience shortages that indicated production was collapsing. By late 1944, as Allied armies approached German borders from east and west, German radio propaganda became increasingly fantastical. Broadcasts promised that secret weapons would turn the war, V-1 and V-2 rockets that would devastate London and force British surrender, jet aircraft that would sweep Allied bombers from the skies, miracle weapons being developed in secret laboratories. Some of these weapons actually existed and were deployed. V-weapons did strike London, jet fighters did enter service, but their impact was far less than propaganda claimed, and they came too late to affect the war's outcome. The gap between promised miracle weapons and actual results further destroyed credibility. Radio broadcasts also increasingly emphasized Nazi racial ideology and hatred of Jews, portraying the war as existential racial struggle for survival. As military situation became hopeless, propaganda fell back on ideological core. Germans must fight to the death because defeat would mean racial extinction at hands of Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. Goebbels' diary entries from late 1944 and early 1945 reveal his recognition that propaganda was losing effectiveness. The people no longer believe our radio reports. They can see that we're losing territory, that our cities are being destroyed, that our promises of victory have proven false. Even the most brilliant propaganda cannot convince people that defeat is victory when they can see ruins around them and enemy armies approaching. We have destroyed our credibility through years of lying, and now when we desperately need people to believe, they no longer trust anything we say. The BBC's triumph, credibility as power. As German radio propaganda collapsed into obviously desperate lies, BBC's credibility advantage became decisive strategic asset. By 1944-1945, BBC German service was more trusted by many Germans than their own official radio. The BBC reported Allied military advances honestly, acknowledged when progress was slower than expected, admitted Allied casualties, and provided balanced assessment that Germans increasingly recognized as more reliable than German official sources. When BBC reported that Allied armies had crossed the Rhine, that German cities had fallen, that German forces were retreating on all fronts, Germans believed these reports even when German radio denied them or claimed tactical victories. The BBC also provided Germans with information about what would happen after defeat, reassuring them that Allied occupation wouldn't mean genocide or enslavement that Nazi propaganda predicted. Broadcasts explained Allied plans for post-war Germany, emphasized that Germans would be held accountable for Nazi crimes, but that ordinary Germans wouldn't be collectively punished, and suggested that cooperation with occupation would lead to rebuilding and eventual restoration of normal life. This messaging was strategically important because it countered Nazi propaganda that Germans must fight to the death because surrender meant extermination. By offering credible vision of life after defeat, BBC helped undermine German will to continue hopeless resistance. The BBC's coverage of D-Day invasion in June 1944 exemplified the credibility advantage. German radio initially dismissed the Normandy landings as minor operation that would be easily repulsed, predicted that German counterattack would throw Allies back into the sea, and claimed that Atlantic wall fortifications were holding firm. BBC reported the landings honestly, acknowledging that fighting was difficult, that casualties were significant, that German resistance was strong, but that Allied forces were successfully establishing beachheads and reinforcements were landing continuously. As days passed and Allied foothold expanded, BBC's reporting proved accurate, while German radio's confident predictions proved false. Germans listening to BBC, despite the danger, got accurate picture of Normandy campaign, while German radio provided increasingly desperate lies about imminent German counterattack that would destroy Allied invasion. The contrast destroyed what little credibility German radio retained. The final broadcasts. As Allied armies approached Berlin in April 1945, German radio maintained propaganda fiction almost until the very end. Broadcasts claimed that new armies were being formed that would throw back Allied invasion, that Hitler was personally directing masterful defense, that secret weapons were about to be unleashed, that victory was still possible through sheer German will. The broadcasts became increasingly surreal as they described victories while the sound of artillery could be heard in Berlin itself. Radio announced that cities had been successfully defended on the same days those cities actually fell to Allied forces. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in. German radio didn't announce his death immediately. Instead, broadcasts claimed Hitler was heroically leading the defense of Berlin. When the announcement of Hitler's death finally came on May 1st, it was a masterpiece of propaganda even in defeat. The broadcast claimed Hitler had died, fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism, at the head of his troops defending Berlin. The reality, suicide in a bunker, was concealed to preserve the heroic myth. Solemn music played, and Admiral Karl Dönitz was announced as Hitler's successor. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The final German radio broadcast acknowledged defeat, but framed it as temporary setback rather than final end. German people, your government has ceased to function. The German armed forces have surrendered. Years of hardship lie ahead, but Germany will rise again. The BBC broadcast news of German surrender worldwide, and celebrations erupted across Allied nations. For Germans listening to foreign broadcasts, the end came as relief rather than catastrophe. The war was finally over, the dying would stop, and whatever came next couldn't be worse than what they'd endured. The final accounting. The radio war between Nazi Germany and the Allies, particularly the BBC, demonstrated several enduring truths about propaganda, credibility, and the relationship between information control and political power. Information control through monopoly and punishment can work in the short term, but becomes unsustainable when reality contradicts official narrative. Nazi Germany could control German domestic broadcasting and punish people for listening to foreign stations, but couldn't prevent reality from contradicting propaganda. Military defeats happened, cities were destroyed, casualties mounted, and no amount of propaganda could make people unsee what they experienced. Credibility matters more than technical sophistication or production values. German radio propaganda was technically brilliant. Professional production, sophisticated techniques, careful scripting. But it systematically lied, and those lies eventually destroyed credibility. BBC's relative honesty, even about bad news, built trust that survived years of war and made BBC's reporting trusted, even by enemy populations. Honesty about setbacks actually strengthens credibility for claims about successes. BBC's willingness to report Allied defeats and problems made its victory reports believable. German radio's refusal to acknowledge problems made everything it said suspect. Propaganda built on lies is fragile and collapses when reality becomes undeniable. German propaganda was powerful when Germany was winning, but collapsed catastrophically when tide turned and lies became obvious. BBC's fact-based approach was sustainable through years of war, regardless of immediate military situation. The radio war showed that free flow of information favors truth over lies in the long run. Nazi Germany had to criminalize foreign listening and threaten people with death to prevent them from accessing alternative information. Implicit admission that their narrative couldn't compete in free marketplace of ideas. The lies that fueled Hitler's empire, broadcast daily into millions of German homes, helped sustain Nazi regime and German war effort for years. But the truth that broke those lies, broadcast by BBC and eventually believed even by Germans living under Nazi control, helped undermine German morale, weaken resolve, and ultimately contributed to Allied victory. Radio was the first mass medium that could reach entire nations simultaneously and cross borders to reach enemy populations. The battle between radio lies and radio truth was less visible than military campaigns, but potentially just as important for determining which side could maintain will to fight when costs became unbearable. In that battle, truth, even difficult, painful truth, proved more powerful than the most sophisticated lies. Dictated lies, dictated lies, dictated lies, dictated lies, dictated lies.